The dust kicked up by the stranger's boots settled like whispered secrets on the weathered planks of Millbrook's only saloon. Sarah Mackenzie stood behind the bar, her calloused hands gripping a glass she'd been cleaning for the better time, watching this drifter with eyes that had seen too much loss for a woman barely past 30. Her husband's death 3 months prior had left her with nothing but debt, a failing establishment, and questions that gnawed at her soul like hungry vultures. The stranger's arrival wasn't coincidence. Nothing ever was in a town where the river had stopped flowing and crops withered under an unforgiving Kansas sun. His spurs clinked against the floor as he approached, hat pulled low over features that seemed carved from the same granite that lined the nearby canyon walls. When he finally looked up, Sarah found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, deep and turbulent with secrets of their own. He ordered whiskey with the kind of voice that spoke of campfires and long nights under star-scattered skies. But there was something else there, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The first hook came when he placed a worn photograph on the bar between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her late husband Thomas standing beside a group of men she'd never seen before, all of them posing in front of what looked like a mine entrance somewhere in the Colorado Territory. Thomas had told her he'd spent those missing years working cattle drives, but the tools in their hands and the dirt on their clothes told a different story entirely. The stranger introduced himself as Marcus Cole, claiming he'd ridden with Thomas during what he called the Silverton job. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as Marcus began weaving a tale that painted her deceased husband in shades of gray she'd never imagined. According to Cole, Thomas Mackenzie hadn't been the simple rancher she'd married, but rather a member of an outfit that had discovered something in those Colorado mountains, something valuable enough to kill for and precious enough to die protecting. The saloon's atmosphere grew thick with tension as Marcus revealed that Thomas had double-crossed his partners, making off with more than his fair share of their discovery. The missing years weren't spent driving cattle across the plains, but rather hiding from men who wanted him dead and treasure that belonged to all of them. Sarah felt the foundation of her marriage crumbling beneath the weight of these revelations. Each word from Marcus's lips another nail in the coffin of the life she thought she'd known. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned across the bar, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he told her that Thomas hadn't died from the fever like Doc Henderson had claimed. The symptoms Sarah had attributed to illness, the sweating, the paranoia, the way Thomas would wake screaming from nightmares about men coming for him, weren't signs of sickness at all. They were the telltale markers of slow poisoning, administered by someone who knew exactly how to make it look natural. The second hook landed when Marcus pulled out a small vial filled with white powder, explaining that he'd found it hidden in Doc Henderson's medical bag after the physician had left town suddenly the day after Thomas's funeral. The same Doc Henderson who'd been asking too many questions about whether Thomas had left anything valuable behind, whether he'd mentioned any hidden caches or secret locations to his grieving widow. Sarah's hands began to shake as she realized that her husband's death hadn't been an act of God, but rather cold-blooded murder. Marcus continued his story, revealing that the remaining members of Thomas's old crew had tracked him to Millbrook months before his death. They discovered his identity, his new life, and most importantly, his beautiful wife who clearly knew nothing about her husband's criminal past. Rather than risk a confrontation that might draw unwanted attention, they'd recruited Doc Henderson to handle the situation quietly, promising him a share of whatever treasure Thomas had hidden in exchange for eliminating the problem permanently. The plan had been simple enough: poison Thomas slowly while pretending to treat his illness, then search for the hidden cache after his death. But Thomas had been cleverer than they'd given him credit for. Sensing his approaching doom, he'd hidden clues throughout the town, breadcrumbs that would lead Sarah to his treasure if she proved smart enough to follow them. The problem was that Doc Henderson and his partners hadn't found these clues yet, and Thomas's death had left them scrambling to locate the fortune before someone else did. Sarah's mind raced as she began remembering odd conversations with her husband during his final weeks, cryptic comments about rivers and stones, about things hidden in plain sight where only she would think to look. Thomas had always been fond of riddles and word games, often leaving her little puzzles to solve that would lead to small gifts or surprise picnics. She'd assumed his rambling during the fever was just delirium, but now she wondered if he'd been trying to tell her something far more important. Marcus explained that he'd come to Millbrook not for revenge, but for justice and his rightful share of what they'd all earned together in Colorado. He claimed that Doc Henderson and the others were still in the area, waiting for the right moment to search the Mackenzie property thoroughly. The widow's mourning period was almost over, and soon they'd find excuses to visit, to help her sort through Thomas's belongings, to offer assistance that came with the opportunity to search every inch of her home. The stranger's story continued to unfold like a map to buried treasure. He told Sarah about the night they discovered the silver mine, hidden deep in the Rockies where no claim had ever been filed. The ore had been so pure, so rich, that even a small amount would set a man up for life. They'd worked in secret for months, extracting enough silver to make them all wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But greed had poisoned their partnership, turning brothers in arms against each other in a deadly game of double crosses and betrayal. Thomas had been the smart one, Marcus admitted with grudging respect. While the others had been planning to cheat each other, Thomas had been planning to disappear entirely. He'd taken the map to the mine, destroyed the markers they'd left behind, and vanished into the night with enough silver to start fresh somewhere far away. The others had spent years tracking him, following false leads and dead ends until they'd finally traced him to this dusty Kansas town, where he'd reinvented himself as a simple rancher with a beautiful wife. Sarah found herself caught between disbelief and a growing certainty that Marcus was telling the truth. Too many pieces fit together too perfectly: Thomas's mysterious past, his occasional nightmares, the way he'd sometimes looked over his shoulder when they traveled to neighboring towns. Even their whirlwind courtship made more sense now. Thomas hadn't fallen in love at first sight, but rather had recognized a perfect cover for his new identity. The revelation stung worse than she'd expected. Had their entire marriage been a lie? Had Thomas ever truly loved her? Or had she simply been a convenient prop in his elaborate deception? Marcus must have seen the pain in her eyes, because his expression softened slightly as he assured her that Thomas's feelings had been genuine. Whatever his original motives, the man had clearly fallen deeply in love with the woman who'd shown him what a normal life could look like. But sentiment wouldn't protect Sarah now. Marcus warned her that Doc Henderson's partners were growing impatient, their searches of the surrounding area turning up nothing. Soon they'd focus their attention on the widow herself, and they wouldn't be as gentle as the good doctor had been. These were men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again if they believed Sarah was hiding something from them. The weight of this knowledge settled on Sarah's shoulders like a lead blanket. She thought about the last few weeks, about the strange men who'd been asking questions around town, about the feeling of being watched whenever she'd ventured outside. What she'd attributed to normal curiosity about the town's newest widow now took on a much more sinister meaning. She was being hunted by men who believed she held the key to a fortune in silver. Marcus offered her a choice that would change her life forever. They could work together to find Thomas's cash, splitting it fairly between them while staying one step ahead of the men who wanted them both dead. Alternatively, she could take his warning and flee Millbrook immediately, abandoning everything she'd built there, but keeping her life in the process. What he wouldn't allow was for her to remain ignorant and defenseless while killers closed in around her. The decision tore at Sarah's heart. Millbrook might be a small, dusty town, but it was her home. The saloon might be failing, but it represented her independence and her connection to Thomas's memory. Running away felt like admitting defeat, like allowing her husband's murderers to win by default. But staying meant accepting that her quiet life as a widow was over, replaced by something dangerous and uncertain. As if sensing her internal struggle, Marcus reached across the bar and placed his weathered hand over hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man who clearly lived by violence and cunning. He told her that Thomas had mentioned her often during their time together in Colorado, always with a mixture of longing and regret. Her husband had loved her enough to try becoming a different man, loved her enough to leave clues that only she could follow, loved her enough to die protecting the secret of her safety. The moments stretched between them, heavy with possibility and threat. Outside, the Kansas wind rattled the saloon's windows while somewhere in the darkness, men with evil intentions moved closer to their prey. Sarah realized that her choice wasn't really about money or treasure at all, but about whether she had the courage to discover who she really was when everything familiar was stripped away. Marcus began explaining what they'd need to do if she chose to trust him. First, they'd have to solve Thomas's riddles and locate the hidden cache before Doc Henderson's partners grew tired of waiting. Then they'd need to retrieve the treasure and disappear before the killers realized what had happened. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees they'd survive the attempt, but it was better than waiting passively for death to find her. The complexity of Thomas's puzzle began to unfold as Sarah shared the cryptic comments he'd made during his final days. He'd spoken repeatedly about the river that had stopped flowing, about stones that remembered secrets, about places where the sun never set on hidden things. At first, Marcus had trouble making sense of these clues, but gradually a pattern began to emerge that pointed toward specific locations around Millbrook. Sarah found herself drawn into the intellectual challenge despite the danger it represented. Thomas had always delighted in her quick wit and problem-solving abilities, often saying she was smarter than any man he'd ever known. Now it seemed he'd crafted his final puzzle specifically for her mind, confident that she alone would be able to unravel its meaning and claim what he'd left behind. Their investigation led them first to the dried riverbed that had given the town its name. The stream that had once brought life to the area had stopped flowing during the drought 2 summers ago, leaving behind a rocky channel filled with stones of every size and description. Thomas had spent many evenings walking along this empty waterway, claiming he found peace in its silence, but now Sarah wondered if he'd been hiding something among the countless rocks. Marcus proved surprisingly patient as they searched through the riverbed by moonlight, examining stones that might hold significance in Thomas's puzzle. It was Sarah who noticed that several larger rocks had been arranged in what looked like natural formations but were actually too precise to be accidental. When they moved these marker stones aside, they discovered a waterproof pouch containing a hand-drawn map of the area around Millbrook and a letter written in Thomas's familiar script. The letter was addressed to Sarah, filled with apologies for the deception and explanations for the choices he'd made. Thomas wrote that he'd never intended to fall in love, never planned to become the kind of man who could abandon his criminal past for a simple life with an extraordinary woman. But Sarah had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible, showing him that redemption was real and that a man could choose to become someone better than he'd been. The map showed several locations around town where Thomas had hidden portions of his Colorado silver, never keeping it all in one place in case his past caught up with him. He'd planned to tell Sarah everything on their 5th wedding anniversary, to give her the choice of whether to stay with a reformed thief or to take her share of the treasure and start fresh somewhere else. His death had robbed them both of that opportunity, but the map would allow Sarah to claim what was rightfully hers. But as they studied the carefully drawn landmarks, Marcus noticed something troubling. Several of the hiding spots had been disturbed recently, showing signs of hasty excavation that suggested someone else was already following Thomas's trail. Doc Henderson and his partners hadn't been as clueless as they'd appeared, and they were systematically searching the locations marked on Thomas's map. The race was on. Sarah and Marcus would have to reach the remaining cache sites before the killers found them, gathering the hidden silver while avoiding a confrontation that would likely end in bloodshed. The stakes had never been higher, not just the treasure, but their lives hung in the balance as they moved through the darkness toward an uncertain future. Their first stop was the old mine shaft on the outskirts of town, abandoned years ago when the ore had played out. Thomas's map indicated he'd hidden something in the depths of the tunnel, but as they approached with lanterns in hand, they could see that someone had been there before them. Fresh footprints in the dust and recently disturbed rocks told the story of a thorough search that had likely been successful. Marcus cursed under his breath as they confirmed that this cache was gone, along with what had probably been a significant portion of Thomas's silver. But there were still 3 more locations on the map, and they'd have to move quickly to reach them before dawn brought too much risk of discovery. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized how real the danger had become, how close death was stalking them through the familiar streets of her hometown. The second location proved more challenging to find. Thomas's map referenced a place where the sun never set on hidden things, which seemed impossible until Sarah remembered the old water tower on the hill overlooking Millbrook. The structure caught the first light of dawn and the last rays of sunset, remaining illuminated longer than any other landmark in the area. More importantly, it was rarely visited by anyone except the maintenance crew that came through twice a year. Climbing the water tower in darkness required more courage than Sarah had known she possessed, but Marcus's steady presence gave her strength she'd never needed before. Inside the tank, wrapped in oilcloth and secured to the inner wall, they found another portion of Thomas's treasure along with a second letter that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. Her husband had written about his hope that she'd never need to read these words. His dream that they'd grow old together in peaceful ignorance of his criminal past. But even as Sarah clutched the silver to her chest, Marcus was watching the streets below with growing concern. Lantern light was moving through town in patterns that suggested a systematic search, and it was heading in their direction. Doc Henderson's partners had noticed their absence and were actively hunting them now, no longer content to wait for a convenient opportunity to strike. The third cache location was the most dangerous because it was hidden beneath the floorboards of the saloon itself, right under the noses of anyone who might be watching the building. But Thomas's letter had been specific about the location, describing a loose board behind the bar where Sarah stood every day, serving drinks to customers who never suspected they were standing over a fortune in silver. Getting back to the saloon without being seen required all of Marcus's frontier skills and Sarah's intimate knowledge of Millbrook's back alleys and hidden paths. They moved like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness, constantly watching for signs of their pursuers, while carrying the silver they'd already recovered. The weight of the treasure seemed to grow heavier with each step, reminding them both of what they stood to lose if they were caught. Inside the saloon, they worked quickly to pry up the floorboard Thomas had marked on his map. Beneath it lay the largest cache yet, enough silver to set them both up for life if they could escape Millbrook alive. But as Sarah counted the coins and ingots, Marcus was positioning himself near the windows, watching for movement outside. The hunters were closing in, and their time was running out. The final cache location was the most personal and the most dangerous. According to Thomas's map, he'd hidden something in the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, beneath a loose stone in the fireplace where they'd spent countless evenings talking about their dreams for the future. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, or Thomas had literally built their life together on top of the evidence of his criminal past. But reaching their bedroom meant going upstairs in a building that was almost certainly being watched by men who wouldn't hesitate to kill them both. Marcus suggested they abandon this final cache and flee with what they had, but Sarah refused to leave without recovering every last piece of her husband's legacy. If she was going to become a fugitive, she'd do it with the complete truth about Thomas's past in her possession. The climb to the second floor felt like walking into a trap, every creaking board a potential death sentence if their hunters were already inside. But the bedroom was empty, moonlight streaming through familiar windows onto the bed, where Sarah had slept alone for 3 months, mourning a man whose secrets were only now coming to light. Behind the fireplace stone, Thomas had hidden not just silver, but also a detailed confession explaining exactly what had happened in Colorado and why. Marcus read the confession while Sarah recovered the last of the silver, his expression growing darker with each revelation. The Colorado job had been more than simple theft. They'd murdered a family of prospectors to claim their mine, killing innocent people whose only crime had been finding silver in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thomas's guilt over these deaths had driven him to seek redemption through marriage and honest work, but it had also made him vulnerable to blackmail from his former partners. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her husband hadn't just been a thief, but a killer who tried to buy his salvation through love and good deeds. The man who'd been gentle with her, who'd never raised his voice in anger, who treated her like precious china, had blood on his hands from crimes that haunted his dreams. Could she live with loving a murderer, even one who'd sought redemption? But there was no time for philosophical reflection as the sound of boots on the saloon's wooden steps announced that their pursuers had found them. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the bedroom window as voices echoed from below. Doc Henderson was back in Millbrook, and he'd brought friends who weren't interested in subtle poisoning. These men planned to extract the location of Thomas's treasure through more direct methods. The window led to a narrow ledge that ran along the building's second story, barely wide enough for a person to stand on safely. Sarah had never been afraid of heights, but climbing out into the darkness with silver-filled saddlebags while killers searched the building below tested every ounce of courage she possessed. Marcus went first, helping her navigate the treacherous passage while keeping one eye on the saloon's interior. Their escape route led them across several rooftops toward the livery stable where Marcus had left his horse. But as they moved through the darkness, Sarah could hear their hunters spreading out through the town, calling to each other as they coordinated their search. Doc Henderson's voice carried clearly in the still air, ordering his men to check every building and search every shadow until they found the widow and her mysterious companion. At the livery stable, Marcus worked quickly to saddle 2 horses, while Sarah kept watch for approaching danger. The silver they'd recovered would weigh them down during any chase that might follow, but abandoning Thomas's treasure after everything they'd risked to claim it seemed unthinkable. They loaded the saddlebags carefully, distributing the weight evenly between both animals while planning their route out of Millbrook. But as they prepared to mount up and ride away from the only life Sarah had ever known, Doc Henderson appeared in the stable doorway with a shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. He'd anticipated their escape route and positioned himself to intercept them, confident that 2 people loaded down with silver couldn't outrun a bullet. The game of cat and mouse was over, and the cats had finally cornered their prey. The confrontation that followed revealed the depths of Doc Henderson's corruption and the extent of his crimes. He admitted to poisoning Thomas, to searching Sarah's property illegally, to planning her death once he'd recovered the hidden treasure. But he also revealed something that shocked both Sarah and Marcus. He wasn't working alone, and his partners included some of Millbrook's most respected citizens. The town's banker, the sheriff, even the preacher had been involved in the conspiracy to locate and steal Thomas's silver. They'd used their positions of trust to gather information, to watch Sarah's movements, to ensure that no one would question their eventual claim that the widow had simply disappeared one night, unable to cope with her grief. The entire community had been corrupted by greed for treasure they'd never rightfully earned. Marcus's hand moved slowly toward his gun, while Sarah tried to process the betrayal of people she'd trusted with her life and her secrets. These weren't strangers who'd come to Millbrook hunting her husband's past, but neighbors who'd attended Thomas's funeral and offered condolences while planning her murder. The realization left her feeling hollow and betrayed in ways she'd never imagined possible. But Doc Henderson had made one crucial mistake in his moment of triumph. He'd positioned himself between them and the stable door, but he hadn't noticed that the back wall of the building was made of old, weathered boards that wouldn't stop a determined horse and rider. Marcus caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward their mounts, trusting that she'd understand his desperate plan without need for words. The explosion of violence that followed seemed to last forever and end in an instant. Marcus drew his gun while simultaneously spurring his horse toward the back wall, Sarah right behind him as shotgun pellets filled the air where they'd been standing. The old boards splintered like matchsticks as 2 horses and riders burst through into the night, leaving Doc Henderson cursing and fumbling to reload his weapon. The chase through Millbrook's dark streets was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Gunfire echoed behind them as the conspiracy's members abandoned all pretense of respectability and pursued the fleeing riders with murderous intent. Sarah had grown up riding horses, but she'd never ridden for her life before, never pushed an animal to its limits while bullets whistled past her head. Marcus proved to be an expert at evasive riding, leading them through alleys and backyards that confused their pursuers and bought precious seconds. But Sarah knew these streets better than anyone, and she guided them toward a route that would take them out of town through the old creek bed where the horses' hoofprints would be harder to follow. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as distance and darkness worked in their favor. By dawn, they were miles from Millbrook, riding hard across the Kansas prairie with Thomas's silver secure in their saddlebags. Sarah had never felt so free or so terrified in her life, cut loose from everything familiar and heading toward an uncertain future with a man she barely knew. But as the sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she realized that she'd never felt more alive. Marcus suggested they head for Colorado territory, where the silver had originally come from and where they might find safety among people who understood the complex morality of frontier life. The treasure they carried would buy them new identities and the chance to disappear completely, but it would also ensure that they'd always be looking over their shoulders for men who wanted them dead. As they rode toward the mountains, Sarah thought about Thomas's final message and the choice he'd given her through his elaborate puzzle. He'd known that discovering his past would force her to choose between the safe, predictable life of a small-town widow and the dangerous, uncertain existence of someone who lived outside the law. By following his clues and claiming his treasure, she'd made her choice as surely as if she'd spoken it aloud. The story concluded as Sarah and Marcus crested a hill overlooking the Colorado Territory, the morning sun glinting off snow-capped peaks that promised new beginnings and fresh starts. Behind them lay the smoking ruins of their old lives, burned away by truth and violence and betrayal. Ahead lay possibilities that neither could fully imagine, adventures that would test them in ways they'd never been tested before. Sarah Mackenzie, the grieving widow who'd served drinks in a dusty Kansas saloon, was gone forever. In her place rode a woman who'd learned that love could coexist with terrible secrets, that ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts of courage, and that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to embrace the dangerous gift of being truly alive. The river might have stopped flowing in Millbrook, but Sarah had found a current that would carry her toward whatever destiny awaited beyond the mountains.